I think often for people, actually working out how to launch a podcast is just really, really overwhelming and really hard to sort of work out where to start. Hi, I'm Sal. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Auddy. So that means that I do all of the marketing and look after the brand and all of the campaigns for our podcasts and all of our clients' podcasts. Often someone has a really amazing idea for a podcast and they might even get so far as recording it, and actually putting in a lot of time and effort into how can I make this different or how can I make it unique. But they probably don't put enough time into thinking about how they will actually get listeners to their podcast. Discoverability is probably the most challenging thing in podcasting at the moment. And that's actually the ability for people to find it. If you go to Apple or you go to Spotify, there's such a plethora of options that just, it's really hard for new ones to get through in reality. Therefore, you need to kind of put as much time into thinking about how you're going to launch your podcast as you do about creating the actual podcast itself. And if you're working for a brand or, for a company that actually has a marketing budget, then that's even better, because it's really tough to do without any budget. I think the sort of core thing that you need to think about is kind of think about a bit of almost an announce or a pre-launch phase for launching your podcast. You've then got a launch phase, and then you've got a sustain phase. There's sort of key elements to each one. Even if you go out and you tell the world about your podcast, if you then don't tell anyone else about it or the fact you've got new episodes, then you're going to see your audience drop off pretty quickly. So I'll talk about each one in turn. Thinking about almost that pre-launch phase or when you're preparing for your launch on a simplest level, what are you going to call it? Or if it's got a really complicated spelling, it's pretty difficult for people to then search for it and find it. So have a think about that. If there are already 16 different versions of podcasts with that name, like either completely rethink it, or have a think about how you can add a bit of uniqueness to it, even if it's adding your name or the host's name to it, that will actually help. I know podcast is an audio medium, but it does need visual assets. When in that pre-launch phase, have a think about how are you actually going to make your podcast stand out against all the other podcasts in that sector? The standard podcast is a square, like it's such a tiny little space, but there's a lot of information, a lot of personality that you need to get across in that. With that, people often are a bit like, I'll just come up with something, I'll just do a colour with the title. But if you're able to spend the money on finding an illustrator or a photographer that will actually help yours just be elevated that much more, it'll be really beneficial. You want to create a trailer, that will kind of get people excited about it. So whether it's making them intrigued or just raising awareness that your podcast is coming, a trailer is a fantastic opportunity to build that sort of awareness for people. In the podcast world, because the trailers are also on a hosting platform, it allows you to do two things. One is you're actually spending the time setting up your podcast on that hosting platform. There's often sort of delays in approval, or it might not pull through straight away. So if you're putting your trailer there, then you're just allowing for that little bit of error in your planning phase. You also want to have a little think about how you get people to subscribe. So during that sort of trailer, sort of pre-launch phase, if you get people to subscribe or follow your podcast on that platform, when you then release your first episode, it'll pop straight up into their feed, which is really, really important because it's pretty tough to get those first things off the ground. During the pre-launch phase, that's the biggest opportunity to actually build anticipation. So whether you use your host, or you've got like a really interesting topic, or you've got like a little bit of a teaser piece of content, that might drive conversation and get people engaged. But it's also the opportunity to get press and PR engaged. But I'd really recommend that you actually speak to a PR agency. At Auddy, we've actually got all of the expertise internally. So, we can help build a marketing strategy, we can do a launch strategy, we can actually do all of the creative assets and help define that key art and build the trailer and everything for people. And work out which media channels, if you've got a finite media budget, you can't just put it everywhere. You need to be very selective about what is the right media channel to reach your objectives and to reach your target audience. If you're, wanting to find out more about marketing or launching your podcast, send us an email. It's on screen at the moment. The launch phase is where you want to build your audience as quickly as possible. That is how many people are downloading, how many people are actually listening to your podcast. And there are different ways that you can do that, but I'd really recommend that you actually do multiple channels. So you can put paid spend, in many different places, but the most cost-effective channels to actually reach people and to tell people about your podcast, social, actually Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, all of those are really good opportunities to find those audiences in order to then talk and announce and tell people about your podcast. Podcasts are the number one way that people discover of other podcasts. So you can put advertising into other podcasts. We do it internally. We've got 370 different podcasts that we represent, but we're not the only providers or ad sales. You can also look at Acast and Spotify. All of them are going to help you to reach your target audience, but you can sponsor a podcast as well. And if you've got a really like-for-like audience, if your podcast is about travel, you might want to sponsor another podcast about travel. Because even though you kind of go, oh, it's a competitor, it's not in many ways. So much the podcast industry likes to actually support and nurture each other. Sponsoring another podcast, you then get the host of that podcast talking about your brand or your podcast. And that will then help drive their audience across to your podcast. But equally, they might come on as a guest onto your podcast because you've then started to build that relationship and built that awareness. Other ways that you might want to spend your marketing budget to support a podcast, digital ads, actually getting them into like programmatic ad buys that'll actually then purchase an ad to your target audience is really effective. But there's also ways you can do a cost per download. So you can actually pay per download, but it's guaranteeing the number of downloads that you get for your podcast fairly early on. Anything under £10,000, I'd probably focus it all in only 1 or 2 channels. So pure advertising actually into other podcasts. And I'd look at your core social channels. That's when you need to really announce it. So that's a big press campaign. You need to try and get as much press coverage as possible. One other thing that it's really good to think about is actually how can you build your own almost customer database. If you have your own email database, you 100% own that email data. And so therefore you can continue to contact your audience and talk to them about your podcast and actually, get them listening and excited about it. We actually talk about this quite a lot in our own emails and in our own blog posts. If you do want to sort of find out more about how you can use email marketing, sign up to our newsletter. It costs so much money to acquire your original audience. So basically, to get those listeners listening to your podcast, you've had to spend loads of money on PR or media or whatever it might be. If your show's not good enough, then that will just be wasted because they might listen to one episode, they're aware of the show, but it's not really for them and they'll just switch off and they'll go and listen to something else. So number one is you have to maintain your quality and you have to make sure that it's a good enough show that people are going to keep coming back for more and more and more, because that will then start to build that loyalty for you. Actually speak to people who've listened to the show, figure out what it is, what did they like, what did they not like, are there tweaks to your show that you can make to actually help to sort of build that loyal audience. So that's with the customers that you've already found, but you have to keep finding new customers. So podcasts very rarely hit it out of the park at the start. It is one of those industries that builds its audience over time, especially if the content's evergreen. So by that I mean it's not date stamped, it's not only relevant today because it's the news. If it's content which is interviewing somebody just about their love of food, for example, that's not going to grow old. You can listen to that in 12 months just as much as you can today. If that's the case, then it doesn't matter when people come to your podcast, they will still then listen back to old episodes. So think about that, because you need to constantly be promoting the podcasts that you have, but also you might be able to pull people in for like relevant older episodes. I call this the sustain phase. This is actually where not only do you hold on to your audience that you've got through the launch phase, but you keep on growing your audience. It's pretty much impossible to do that without kind of 2 things. One is more content, release more shows. And the second is actually more media spend. If you have a finite series, but you have unlimited media spend, then you can keep new people coming to it. But if you have a limited media spend, you need to constantly be giving people new content to keep them engaged and keep them listening, keeping them interested. As I've talked about, there's sort of 3 main phases for launching the podcast. There's the pre-launch phase when you're not just deciding what you're calling it and what it looks like, but you're also starting to let people know about it. So it's not available to listen to, but they can listen to a trailer, they can sort of maybe have some PR interviews and they can get excited about it. Then you've got the launch phase. I wouldn't recommend spending any media budget before the launch phase. People want to be able to have that instant gratification and listen to something straight away. So that's where all your media spend goes. That's when driving that awareness, driving that audience to come and listen to it. You might do it on day one, or you might do it on episode 3 or 4 once there's a few for people to listen to. And then after those sort of 2 main phases, how are you then going to sustain that audience? How are you going to let them know about all of the new episodes coming up, or about the fact that you've got a fantastic guest that you just can't wait to tell them about? Or how are you going to get them to keep on coming back to listen for more? And you need to think about that, because it very rarely happens organically. You need to sort of think about it, plan for it, and really just work hard to make it successful. If you found this video really, really useful, I'd love it if you liked or subscribed to it. You can do it up here, and also just come to our website, sign up to our blogs, and you can read huge amounts of information, hopefully give you some tips and some insight into the rest of the industry.